adjusted properly, but we're going to try to get down through verse 9 as is indicated to us on the PowerPoint, right? And this is the beginning of the book. We're going to call this God's Commission because this is going to be the moment where we see the transition take place between Moses and Joshua in terms of the transition of leadership that takes place in Israel. We've already talked about Joshua, as we talked about last week. Joshua is not a new figure to the Old Testament at this point. He is referred to on numerous occasions and with numerous events in the books of Exodus, Numbers, and in Deuteronomy. We know that Joshua is very loyal to Moses. Again, that will come out in what we have to say this morning. We know that Joshua was not just loyal to Moses, but Joshua was also appointed by God to be the successor to Moses. And we know that we kind of mentioned this last week, but on one occasion, Moses laid his hands on Joshua and thereby denoted to the people that Joshua was the next leader. Again, all of that happening by the will of God. So what are the key points to think about this morning as we look at the first 9 verses of Joshua chapter 1? First thing that we want to take into consideration is that God judges, or God looks at a person's life and takes into view the total picture of it. Sometimes as humans, we have a tendency to look at people and make judgments about them based on one particular moment in time. And a lot of times that's not a good way of taking in somebody's life and trying to get an assessment of what they have done. Instead, God a lot of times looks at the totality of a person's life. In other words, looking at what they have done over the course of their entire life. You know, obviously that points to the need to be faithful for the entirety of our lives, to be faithful to God for the entirety of our lives. But it also points to the fact that this is very different than how humans sometimes react. We typically want to take a person, especially a person that we don't like, and we typically don't like them based on one or a couple of moments where they did something that was not good. God doesn't necessarily see it in that same way. He takes into view the totality of things. We're also going to see that with God's help, what comes out of Joshua 1 is that with God's help, we can manage through the difficult moments in life. God does not expect his people to be able to fully handle their problems by themselves. That's going to be important for why the people of Israel will have the chance of success in the book of Joshua. It's also reflective of why we as Christians can be successful in life, despite the fact that we are, we're working towards different goals than many in the world. Those are the key things that we want to think about as we go through Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9 this morning. Again, a passage perhaps that's pretty familiar to us in the book. So we're going to divide this into 2 sections, verses 1 through 5, Joshua's connection to Moses, and then verses 6 through 9, which is going to be a call to courage. But we want to look at verses 1 through 5 from this aspect of how Joshua is connected to Moses and how the writer is making sure that we understand Joshua's connection to Moses. So we see that the book itself opens up with Moses' death. And let's start with verses 1 through 5. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. So we see that the book itself opens up with Moses' death. Again, a very important moment in Israel's history. Also very important to connect Moses' death to the beginning of Joshua's leadership. Notice here that Moses is designated as what? What is Moses' title in verses 1 and 2? Notice that Moses is defined as God's servant, right? Verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, and then by the Lord's own words given to Joshua, verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. And so what that indicates to us is that God has obviously saw fit to look at the totality of Moses' life and call him his servant. Now, there were times in Moses' life where he was not the servant of God, right? We think back to Exodus chapter 3, the different excuses that Moses made for why he should not do the Lord's will in helping get the people of Israel out of Egyptian captivity. We know that Moses also was not acting as a servant of God when he rejected God's command to speak to the rock and instead struck the rock and did exactly what God said not to do. There were key moments, there were moments in Moses' life where he really reflected anything other than a servant of God. And yet, verses 1 and 2, God is very clear. He identifies Moses as his servant. He's looking at the totality of life. If somebody would read for us Hebrews 3, verses 1 through 5, because the writer of the book of Hebrews also is going to make the same point about Moses.
Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of a heavenly calling, consider Jesus the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, as Moses also was in all his house. For he has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, by just so much as the builder of the house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all his house as a servant, for testimony of those things which were to be spoken later.
So notice that the writer of Hebrews says on two occasions, right? Moses was faithful in all God's house. Verse 2 and in verse 5, Moses was faithful in all God's house, and that's why he was designated as God's servant. Now, in what way was Moses faithful in all his house to God? How had Moses demonstrated his faithfulness to God?
He continued leading the people in spite of their rebellion.
Right. The point is that Moses was faithful in all God's house because Moses' mission was to deliver the people of God out of Egyptian captivity and lead them to a land flowing with milk and honey that we see referenced multiple times in the books, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Moses, in essence, has earned that designation. By the end of his life, God could clearly say Moses was his servant indeed. And that again shows that God took into picture Moses' total life. But what is said about Joshua here? What is Joshua's title at this point in the book? Notice that it says that Joshua, the son of Nun, at this point, it identifies him as Moses' assistant, right? Notice, I just find it interesting. Moses is called the servant of the Lord after his death. Joshua is not called the servant of the Lord yet because of what? Joshua is only connected here as Moses' assistant, but God does not declare him his servant yet because of what? In other words, has Joshua fulfilled his mission at this point? Has he fulfilled God's mission? Joshua is just beginning is the point, right? Joshua's mission is what follows in verses 1 through 9, right? God's commission to Joshua is God again telling Joshua what he's about to do. Joshua has not been given that designation yet, right? He hasn't necessarily proven himself faithful at this point because he hadn't completed God's mission for him. But somebody turn and read Joshua 24 and verse 29 for us. Joshua 24 and verse 29. What does it say about Joshua in that verse?
Now it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old.
So how is Joshua identified in Joshua 24 and verse 29? He's identified as God's servant, which is an indication that Joshua did what? He fulfilled the mission that God had put forth to him, right? That was given at the totality, that was given in perspective of the totality of his life. And that's the point that I was, trying to emphasize here, that, God's looking at the entire picture. There were moments where Moses messed up. There were moments where Joshua messed up. But that didn't define their entire life. What God was concerned about is where were they at the end. And in both situations, God identifies both men as his servants for that reason. So as Christians, I think that's a good example to look at. We all want to be called the servants of God because that means that we are followers of him. And the point being is that both of these men have this designation because they were essentially faithful to God's will, faithful to God's mission to the end of their lives. And that's very important to take away, right? We need to look at the totality of life when it comes to, as people, we need to look at the totality of life when it comes to their work with God and not just focus on the times where they mess up, right? That's the point. We know, of course, though, that there is no doubt to Joshua's authority. We're not going to read this passage per se, but in Numbers chapter 12, remember that Aaron and Miriam tried to challenge Moses' leadership. And how did God identify who Israel's leader was? What would God do to that person? Or what would God do with that person? Based on that text, if you remember. Yeah, if I speak to him in a dream, if I talk to him directly, that's what God was saying in Numbers 12, is that if I communicate to someone directly, that's a clear sign that I have appointed this person as the leader. Well, what is God doing in verse 2 with Joshua? God is speaking directly to Joshua. That is a sign to the people of God that there is no doubt, based on Numbers 12, that this is who God has designated as the leader of his people, now that Moses has died. Again, Joshua was Moses' assistant, but this evidence of God speaking directly to Joshua reaffirms the fact that he is indeed the leader of the people of God at this point. So Moses' death is then important. So what is Joshua's mission? Well, that is what's given to us in verses 3 and 4. And that is basically to take control of every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, with the boundaries of that territory being defined basically by verse 4. That's what Joshua's mission is. Notice here that God said in verse 3, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you. Again, in verse 2, he said the same thing. Go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them. We notice here that God makes the point, right? This is the land that I am giving to you. What that indicates to us is that the Israelites had not done anything to earn this land, right? They could not claim, in essence, they could not claim this land as something that they owned because they had done something to earn it. That's what God's point is in verses 3 and 4, is that this land that you are about to embark into, the land that you are about to settle, this is something that I have given to you. Again, Deuteronomy 12, verses 9 and 10, I believe indicate the same thing, that this is a land that God had given to his people and not a land that they had worked for to earn. And so if this land is a gift from God, what does that imply about the people in the land if it is just a gift? what could God do with that land if he so chose to do? God had every right within his power to take away that land if he chose to, right? We know, of course, that becomes a theme for the rest of the Old Testament, where when the Israelites had forgotten, essentially, that this was a gift given to them by God, that they got into trouble, right? The book of Judges repeatedly is filled with different instances where that takes place. As we've already talked about, the past several months, that was kind of the whole point of the captivity, right? The people of God forgot that originally this was a land that was given to them as a gift. There were conditions that they had to meet in order to retain that land. And as a consequence, they forgot that it was a gift. That's where they took for granted the fact that they own the land, or they took for granted their right to live in the land. And that's why captivity happened. Simply because they forgot to remember that this was a gift given to them. And so what we have here on the map on the right is, and there's no perfect representation of this because some of these places are not well defined based on archaeologists trying to kind of guesstimate where they travel. But what you have here is a possible travel from Egyptian captivity in the book of Exodus to where, of course, they get to Ezon-Geber, and there's the wandering in the wilderness. Where we're at now is up here, where in Joshua chapter 1, the people are on the eastern side of the Jordan, and they're about to enter into the land. Again, that's what's said in verse 2. They're at this point where they're about ready to cross over the Jordan River and into the land of Canaan. And we have defined for us all of the territory of this land. Again, we notice here that God's promise regarding this has not changed. Just as he promised to Moses. Again, even though a whole generation died wandering in the wilderness, God was still going to keep the promise in terms of the entirety of the land that they would be able to settle on. That promise remained consistent is the emphasis of verse 3. The land that Joshua and the people would now enter is the same land, the same dimensions of the land that were guaranteed to Moses. So Moses has now gotten them to the brink, but now it's Joshua's responsibility, it's his mission to now provide rest to his people. Somebody would read for us Joshua 21, 43 through 45, which is written to define the end of Joshua's time as leader of God's people.
So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass.
So notice there what had happened, according to the writer, what had happened by the end of Joshua's life. What does it say about the condition of the people? What did they have? They had rest and land, right? That's what Joshua's job was. Moses got them to the brink or got them on the border, on the edge. Now it was Joshua's time to fulfill his role to give God's people rest. Now, this concept of rest is highly emphasized in the book of Hebrews. There are a lot of parallels between the Old Testament and the book of Hebrews, but this concept of providing rest to God's people is of utmost importance in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, it talks about essentially this same concept that the people of God were looking for a place of rest, which the earthly indication of that was certainly regarding Canaan. But again, as Christians, we are like the people of God, essentially, as in the process of going through life, we are looking for rest in the same way. And what is the rest that the writer of Hebrews emphasizes that we look for? Heaven, right? And so that parallel there about looking for rest, Joshua providing rest for his people. Again, in the book of Hebrews, that is referenced as well. But it's also tied into the idea for us as Christians that as they were looking for rest, we're looking for a permanent heavenly rest. And if you go back to the book of Hebrews, what happened to those who demonstrated an unbelief in God when it came to that rest? They could not enter. They could not enter that rest. Hebrews 4 and verse 5 talks about those who, because of their unbelief in God, did not enter into that rest. It's a reference to all these people who died out in the wilderness because they did not believe the report of the spies and believe in the power of God to overcome the people of the land of Canaan. They were not able to enter into that rest. So the people who are going to enter into into the land of Canaan, as we're going to see at the end of chapter 1, are going to have the faith that they can enter into this land and establish the land of Canaan as the land for God's people. Just as the same way for us today, if we don't take into consideration about rooting out any form of unbelief in our lives, we don't have a hope of entering into the rest that is promised, and that, of course, being heaven. So that's Joshua's mission. And so we're kind of mentions here the extent of the land. And the extent of the land is not going to be fully realized until David and Solomon. But what you have up here on the right is a kind of a rough picture of perhaps the borders of the land that have been described in Joshua 1 and verse 4. Again, even though they're going to go into the land and settle the land, at least the full extent of the borders are not going to be realized until you get to David and Solomon, right? When the kingdom of Israel is at its height territorially. But again, we see the dimensions given going all the way to the south. You have Egypt to the, if I can get around there, there we go. You got Egypt to the left. Again, keep in mind the people of God are somewhere in this vicinity at this point, but they have all the way almost to the, to the border of Egypt. You've got up to the river Euphrates, which is all the way up here. Again, you got the Mediterranean Sea. You have all the way to the north, which is the boundary territory. I know that says Hamath, but it's the boundary territory for the Hittites who are mentioned here. A wide expanse of land, a very important piece of land in the geography of that time period. The land of Canaan naturally set in a middle border zone between Egypt and Mesopotamia. Again, the land of Canaan with Egypt to the west, Mesopotamia to the east. Again, that's why in the Old Testament we see a lot of conflict for the people of God, typically coming from, if it's not coming from one of these smaller nations around them, we see a lot of conflict, especially later in Israel's history, coming from Egypt and either the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians in Mesopotamia. Canaan sat right in the middle of it. A lot of times that was the battleground between the major powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia, which is why we read a lot about them in the Bible. And it was also a major land route for travel. We mentioned this several months ago, but the land of Canaan, Israel, as it would eventually become known under Joshua, would have a lot of people travel through, which also meant, as we know from the time of David, that the nation of Israel would become a very wealthy nation because of all the trade that would take place. Because again, you're not crossing, if you're in Mesopotamia, you're not crossing here to get to Canaan because it's just desert. Instead, a lot of times in Mesopotamia, you go up like Abraham did and you come down. So you have to go through Canaan in order to get to Egypt. So you got a lot of trade that flows through there. It's going to help establish Israel as a very prosperous nation later on. And again, that gives you an idea of what the boundaries look like. We notice, though, that God also supports Joshua, verse 5. Like Moses, verse 5 indicates that God would stand behind Joshua. No man shall be able to stand before you. Going down of the sun shall be no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. In other words, there wasn't going to be anyone who was going to successfully challenge Joshua for becoming the leader of Israel. We know that Moses' leadership was challenged by Miriam and Aaron. We know that it was challenged in number 16 by Korah, where, again, Moses' authority was almost undermined. And what did God do to the rebellious individuals in number 16? Yeah, the earth swallowed them up, kill the rebels against Moses, right? Because God was not going to allow anyone to undermine Moses' role as leader of his people. He's given that same guarantee to Joshua, again, reinforcing the fact that Joshua is the next leader of the people of God. As he states in verse 5, the Lord's aid would always be present. Again, the end of verse 5, just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. He gave that same that indication, Deuteronomy 31, 6 through 8. The same concept, I will not leave you nor forsake you. We know that passage is also referred to in the New Testament, Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6, where the writer of Hebrews there is taking a passage from the Old Testament, which the reader was obviously very familiar with, and applying that to the New Testament. That God, in the age of Christianity, with his people, the church, he will not leave nor forsake them, as a way to remind them that, as a way to remind us that God still supports his people today. And it's important to keep that in mind. Again, that goes back to the second point, and that was that with God's help, we can manage through the difficult moments in life, as evident by what he says to Joshua. It's reaffirmed to us in Hebrews 13 that for those who are faithful to him, God will not leave nor forsake you. So you've got that clear connection to Moses. That's important to help remind the reader of Joshua's role. And then verses 6 through 9, a familiar passage to us, the call to courage. Again, verse 6, be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you, be strong and courageous? Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Again, a call to courage. Passage very familiar to us. We notice that the phrase, be strong and courageous, in some form or fashion is reaffirmed 3 different times in this section. Verses 6, verse 7, and verse 9. It's reaffirmed 3 times, be strong and courageous. That is important in this context because the Israelites know what they are up against. We already know, based on what happened with the 12 spies, that the people of God know about the inhabitants of the land. They know about the mission that is given to them, which is going to require a lot of fighting, which naturally is something that I think most people should naturally have a fear of. I don't think it's good for people who love war. I don't think that's a great mindset to have at all. War sometimes is necessary, but it's not something that people should look forward to, in essence. They knew what they were up against. They knew that this is going to require a lot of effort and sacrifice. Again, you think about war at this time, a lot of times war is being fought where you are physically right there killing somebody and you're dealing with the pain and agony of your own injuries. It's not easy to think about for us. And so, yes, this is going to be difficult, but this is why this call is reaffirmed 3 times. Be strong and courageous. Because, yes, we've got to admit that what's about to happen is going to be very difficult. It's going to be very tough to deal with. And that's the essence of it. The difficult parts of life have begun. In other words, you thought it was difficult wandering through the wilderness. You thought it was difficult relying on quail and manna. You thought it was difficult trying to, again, navigate the desert. But in essence, God's call at this point is saying that the difficult parts have only just begun. Now you're going to have to do a lot of fighting to be able to settle in the land that I have given to you. A process, as we're going to see, is not going to necessarily be as easy as one might think for the people of God. And so that's why this message needs to be reaffirmed. But again, the Lord's presence would give them the strength to carry on. As we're going to see in numerous instances where God, through divine power, intervenes and helps his people out. Again, reminding us that the only way that we can get through in life is by trusting in the power of God and allowing the Lord to be the source of our strength in order to get through life. The Israelites could not have settled in the land without the help of God. They cannot enter into their rest without the help of God. We as Christians cannot enter into our permanent, eternal rest without relying on the Lord's help in life. That's a very good parallel that comes out here. And then the final slide is, in order for you to trust in the Lord, verse 8, you have to know the law. Again, the book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. In other words, there are conditions in order to keep this inheritance. As he said in verse 7, you cannot turn from the right hand or to the left when it comes to following the commands of the law of God. You've got to keep it in its entirety. You have to do exactly according to all that it says in order for your way to be prosperous and then for you to have good success. Again, we're going to see that this is the problem that occurs with Achan's sin. When Achan turned to the right hand or to the left and decided to not keep the entirety of the law, that's where difficulty arose when the people of God lost the first battle of Ai. This point, in essence, will keep the people of God on the straight and narrow. Again, you could think about this from the fact that the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness because, in essence, they questioned the word of God. They questioned the law of God. But here the point is that the ability to settle the land of Canaan, the degree of success, is all dependent on whether or not you're going to take seriously the word of God and live by it. In Psalm chapter 1, what did the psalmist say about the man who meditated on the word day and night? What was said about him? He was a blessed man, which means a happy man, right? The happy man is the one who meditates on the word of God day and night because it keeps him on the straight and narrow. People of God are going to be happy when they do the exact same thing as what the man in Psalms 1 would do. And obviously, it's going to define the servant of God. Again, for Joshua to become the servant of God, at least to be faithful in fulfilling his mission by the end of the book, he's going to have to be someone who knows the law of God and knows exactly what God expects. And we're going to see that throughout the book moving forward. But we're out of time. Are there any final thoughts or comments on what we said up to this point in class?
It reminds us that Moses died, but God didn't die, and God's work didn't die. So, there was an appropriate time for mourning 30 days for Moses.
Right.
But then, Joshua's time, we got to get to work. There's more work to be done. So today, when influential people in the church may die,
Absolutely. God's work would certainly continue despite the fact that Moses had, at this point, has now died. We'll pick up next week in verse 10, and we'll try to cover through the rest of chapter 18, where a potential challenge does await Joshua in the process of going to the land of Canaan. But thank you for your time and your attention this morning.